Well, over the next couple of weeks, we should learn some very interesting details about the fate of President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, in regards to his failure to pay taxes. Rules for thee, but not for me. Joining us on the program this morning, a political commentator. He's over at Young Voices. Donald Kimball joins us this morning. Donald, this whole case is really interesting, and I have to say I find it kind of ironic. You watch the State of the Union, and you've got Joe Biden screaming about the wealthy paying their taxes, yet his own son didn't bother doing it at all.
Absolutely. Well, and the other funny aspect is the claims from the defense to say this is the least ordinary prosecution a person could imagine. A very funny thing to hear in a year where we're seeing years worth of cases being brought up against President Trump, and it just kind of happens to be in an election year as well. So the moral high ground from the defense saying, oh, this is all politically motivated and this is totally unprecedented in a year where, again, President Trump's getting tried in this way and President Biden's trying to make the argument of fair share of taxes and all that. It's a very funny juxtaposition.
I mean, let's maybe you can help me and our listeners this morning. Hunter Biden did not pay his federal income tax, correct? I mean, that is a verified, proven thing at this point?
Right. Well, and the funny thing is, of course, the leading up to this, last year, there was going to be a plea deal because there are multiple charges being brought against Hunter Biden. There are the tax charges as well as a gun felony. And part of the plea deal was going to be that he was going to, originally he was going to be able to get off with no jail time, no guilty pleas. There were some whistleblowers in the IRS that said, hey, the Justice Department has actually hamstrung this investigation. The plea deal changed. He was then going to have to plead guilty to the tax charges to avoid felony time. A judge dismissed the case because it was too cozy. And so then the plea deal sort of has fallen apart, which is why we are where we are today.
It's this whole situation and saga with the Biden, as you'll call them, the Biden crime family, I do find to be rather interesting. So there was a hearing yesterday out in Los Angeles. Hunter Biden was not in attendance, but one of his attorneys were. And as you noted, they made this claim that this is not normal prosecution. However, his lawyers gave, at least from everything I've read this morning, no evidence that the tax charges are political, and it seems pretty cut and dry. You don't pay your taxes, you're liable to be gone after by the federal government, right?
Right. Well, that's exactly the case. You know, the reality is, even if the charges were brought up because of political motivations, you know, let's say that the only reason he was getting investigated was because of a political hatred. If the crime is there, you probably ought to address the elephant in the room. If I'm on a playground at school and I see a kid break a window and then I report it to the teacher, they're not going to say, oh well, he just doesn't like the other kid, and so we're just going to ignore the broken window. That's a silly standard. But of course, the other thing to remember is that we're in a conflict with Ukraine, and Hunter Biden is kind of at the heart of some of the possible corruption with Ukraine, because he was sitting on the board of Burisma, a Ukrainian energy company that was trying to get in good with the United States government after the 2014 coup. So there's this active conflict with Ukraine, which of course is going to bring heightened scrutiny. And this is nothing to say about the laptop story, which was suppressed, was testified to be false by a bunch of CIA witnesses, and then now has been verified to be the actual property of Hunter Biden, all but 100% there. So, of course, there's going to be increased scrutiny. The idea that this is just purely politically motivated is a very, very silly standard to bring up.
Donald Kimball is our guest this morning. He is a political commentator over at Young Voices. And I do kind of find it a little more ironic and rich. You know, you remember the first term for former President Donald Trump. There was constant criticisms against his children and against his family about how, they're scumbags, they're not good people, they're rich and they're entitled. Yet I don't see the same necessary criticism against the president's son, who, as we know, is an avid crack addict, lied on a federal gun permit, doesn't pay his taxes, enriches himself using his daddy's name. I do find it quite rich and ironic that the same scrutiny of the Trump children doesn't seem to add up for old Hunter Biden.
Of course. Well, and even in his public statement, I think it was about a year ago, when he came out and he made a big public showing about the hearings he would and would not be a part of, he admitted, very sort of begrudgingly, that he had made some mistakes. And then, of course, he tried to turn the whole thing into a big political witch hunt. But the reality is that it's not just that he made some mistakes. He made mistakes to a high order. The estimates are about $1.7 million of missing funds, which, at best could have been spent on drug habits and maybe some less tasteful activities. At worst, could have been going to people to pay them off. So the fact that we're putting them under scrutiny, it's not a matter of, we're just attacking president's children, in the same way that I think some of the criticisms levied against Donald Trump's children were put. If they have actions that should be scrutinized, well, we'll scrutinize them. But you're right, there is a very strong double standard when we see actual criminal conduct from one side and not that from the other.
There's been a lot of smoke in regards to Hunter Biden, no pun intended, and even the president himself. But, I mean, as we get closer and closer to November, Donald, are we going to see that fire actually take place? Are Republican lawmakers or are courts? I know that there's impeachment investigations that are continuing. Are we going to get to this fire? Are we going to see that evidence before November? What is your thoughts on that?
It's hard to say. I don't have a crystal ball to look into the future. One very possible reality is if the DNC and the people behind the scenes decide that Biden is becoming too much of a liability and there is either too much smoke or maybe for other reasons, like he's not looking great in the polls, I think that there could be strings pulled from behind the scenes to oust him and to make this sort of you better retire now, quiet down, get out of the way, make room for another candidate. And so in that scenario, I could see this being used, maybe not in the full extent. I think that if they were to try to push him aside, they would do so in a way that's comfortable for him and his family, maybe write them off somewhere to some private place where they're not bothered. But it could be used, weaponized from his own side if they feel like he's too much of a liability, if there is too much smoke building up to a potential fire.
Yeah, and I think we're very much going on to that point right now, approaching that point where there is just so much smoke, and we're just waiting for that little evidence of some fire to really potentially sink the Biden ship here. I mean, it's just amazing when you compare and contrast, the Trump administration and the Trump family compared to the Biden family, the constant microscope that Trump and his family was under and is now. He's got, 90 some odd charges that could land him in prison for some ungodly amount of time, like 400 or 500 years if he was convicted and received maximum penalties on all of them. Yet you compare and contrast that with the current administration, and it's a lot of talk, but outside of Hunter Biden, we're not really seeing that same level of criminal action against Biden, his brother, or the rest of the family.
Well, and it's interesting because I'm very much a proponent that we should all be treated equally under the law, but we also have to recognize the reality that we live in a system where that's just not the case. Historically, we've had pardons, we've had people kind of looking the way, especially when it comes to crimes of a certain stature, crimes that maybe aren't as impactful as others. We definitely live in an over-litigated society. I think every citizen breaks the law multiple times a day, whether they know it or not. And so when it comes to leveling all these charges at President Trump, there's definitely a different standard being applied there. Now, he may have broken some of those. We'll have to see, and I think that there should be accountability. But the reality is that this is a different standard that's being applied from the past. And I think that shows a lot of the antipathy towards President Trump's potential return to office, rather very blatantly displayed in contrast to how the obvious criminal and frankly dangerous behavior of someone like Hunter Biden is trying to be smoothed over.
Well, let me ask you this, because you just kind of led me into this. And it's something I struggle with, and I've talked to the listeners about struggling with it before. I couldn't agree more with everything that you just said. The rule of law, equal application of the law. Donald, it seems like we're at this point now where that's just not happening. There is no equal application. Certain individuals, based on their wealth, their political affiliation, their status, seem to constantly skirt under the law and are never held accountable. And I think it's kind of a moral quandary for conservatives and Republicans. Do you start acting under that same vantage point when you're going after the left? And to me, it's a moral quandary that I think conservatives and Republicans are going to have to ask themselves.
Yeah, I agree. We don't live in a perfect world, and there have to be compromises made. In my mind, I think one of the most underrated values by our culture, ironically, is the peaceful transfer of power. And people will point to January 6th, riding close on that. But if we, regardless of how you feel about that, I think it's very overblown. But regardless of how you feel about that, we have to look at the scenario that's bringing about any sort of flare-ups with violent transfers of power, and that's avoiding peaceful. And a lot of that had to do with this double standard for the rule of law, the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story itself. And so my initial thought is that basically as a country, we kind of need to call sort of a peace as it is to say, listen, we're going to give sort of a presidential pardon, maybe, going forward here, but then we are going to start applying these standards of law equally. You need to have some sort of incentive for the people who may already be in this corrupt game to not feel like we're weaponizing a system and then have these eruptions and so we can have a transfer peaceful of power. But there is a point where we need to start course correcting and say, look, this is untenable. If we have a political class and society that is just above the rule of law and skirting these things, then we are in basically a two-class system in the United States, which is the political haves and the political have-nots.
No question about that. Donald Kimball is our guest here this morning. Donald, had an opportunity to check out last night your Good Take, Bad Take podcast. Tell us a little bit about that. What's it about and where do folks find it?
Well, yeah, my friend and I, we go through the internet. We find all of the common takes or not common takes on the internet that you see flying around. We try to break down what arguments are being employed, whether they're good or bad. That way, if you see that post that's gone viral and you just can't quite put your finger on what's wrong with it, hopefully we can help break that down for you. It's on YouTube at Good Take, Bad Take podcast.
Donald, thank you so much for the time this morning. Appreciate your insight. Looking forward to catching up again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Donald Kimball, our guest here this morning, as, again, a lot of smoke in the Biden crime family. We're just waiting to see that little trickle of fire, and we'll maybe see the whole ship go down in regards to the Biden family.